Admire these beautiful images of Tugboat, the beloved dog, and at the same time, the nickname of our protagonist of today, the Gringo, Tyler Hamilton, possibly one of the darkest characters in the history of cycling, and who has been able to whiten his image thanks to ratting out his former teammate, Lance Armstrong. However, we here in Cycling Stories don't forget his epic 2 years in the CSC team of Bjarne Riis, one of the most doped teams in cycling history. Want to know how Hamilton mutated from a simple climber to an all-rounder capable of crushing the world's best riders at the tender age of 32? Well, without further ado, let the show begin. Tugboat's mind in 2001 was much like Homer Simpson's when he starts getting birdies in his head. He wasn't focused on the road, but on comments from those closest and dearest to him. The year before, Hamilton had won the Criterium de Dauphiné ahead of Lance Armstrong himself, including an exhibition in Mont Ventoux, and he had done it using the same doping program that Lance Armstrong had used. This made him think that maybe he too could be a future Tour de France winner, although he couldn't do it at US Postal. In fact, it was low-cost Lance himself who found out about his hitherto loyal teammates' intentions, and as he used to do in those years, he cut off his EPO supply so that he would ride the 2001 Tour de France in full Paniagua mode. Evidently, without the drug load in his vein, Tugboat almost didn't finish in the top 100 in that edition, and crawled in all the mountain stages. His contract was up, and he decided to go to the other man that he knew doped like a pig in his time as a professional cyclist, Bjarne Riis. Our favourite alopecia character had already been a team manager for several years after selling out the cycling collective at the 1998 Tour de France, and his teams were always invited to the big races. In his first seasons, he famously tuned up the French rider Laurent Jalabert, who rose again under the arms of the affable Riis, and his beloved Italian trainer Luigi Cecchini, winning in his last 2 years as a pro the red and white jersey of the King of the Mountains in the Tour de France, as well as other prestigious races like the Classica San Sebastian at only 34 years of age. Now another squishy 31-year-old cyclist, Tugboat Hamilton, who could also play the role of carrier pigeon, appeared as his new leader. Riis was still using the methods that had made him Tour de France champion 6 years earlier, but he was a bit out of date. He needed to know what secrets were cooking in the unbeatable US Postal team, and Hamilton could offer them to him. A perfect marriage that in fact already shone in their first campaign together. Their first stop was the 2002 Giro d'Italia, one of the most fun and at the same time surreal competitions in the history of cycling. After shining in the first days and even wearing the competition leader's maglia rossa, the bald Italian Stefano Garzelli, winner of the 2000 edition, was expelled from the race, despite being in the ranks of Giorgio Squinzi's all-powerful Mappai squad. The reason? A positive test after beating the always clean Santi Perez in the sprint on the 5th stage, the same stage in which Tugboat slightly fractured his collarbone, and the positive test was due to, listen up now, probenecid, the same masking substance that Pedro Delgado had taken in the 1988 Tour de France 14 years earlier. Garzelli himself claimed that it was a mistake, that he had been given probenecid in some pieces of chicken that he had eaten days before. Never go to a Kentucky Fried Chicken before getting on the bike, folks. They let him compete until a counter-analysis made him look bad, but not before he won another stage in a Giro that seemed to be tailor-made for him. It could have been the turn of Gilberto Simoni, the legendary climber and star signing of the Saeco team, but the poor fella. Before the start of the high mountains, Simoni tested positive for cocaine in a surprise doping control days before the start of the Giro. Cocaine that, according to Gibbo himself, had been caused by a dentist, following in the footsteps of the legendary tradition of the Latvian Peter Ugramov regarding dental problems. So, be careful if you go to a dentist's office, especially after eating chicken. In addition, the also doped Francesco Casagrande was sent off in the first mountain stage after assaulting the Colombian Freddy Gonzalez after fighting for third place on a third category mountain pass. With all these casualties, Tugboat starts to grow little by little and shows the first signs of his quality in the last week, just when Rees taught him that he had to take the necessary blood bag to improve his performance. He won the first long time trial in Numana, beating a real super specialist like Sergei Onchar, and went from being outside the top 10 to onto the podium instantaneously. In the mountain stages, he loses time on Paolo Salvadelli, the Italian madman of risky descents who took advantage of his ability to win the Giro with the modest index team. And in the second time trial, Tugboat found himself exhausted and without the necessary strength to close the gap. Even so, he overcame the doped climber, Pietro Cauchioli, and managed to finish the Corsa Rosa in second place. All this with a broken collarbone from the fifth day. His first Grand Tour podium at the age of 31, just like his director Rees in the 1995 Tour de France. It seemed that he had found the magic formula, and so he would raise his level in 2003, the decisive year for his assault on the Tour de France, and for which he decided to increase the payments of his new medical contact, Dr. Efumiana Fuentes. Lance had Michele Ferrari, but Tugboat wanted to be the flagship of American cycling in the first part of the season. And for that, he decided to spend more than €150,000 on Ufe Fuentes' preferential treatments for the beginning of the campaign. He started with 2,000 units of EPO in the middle of Christmas. While in the training camps of the CSC team, he would carry out his first blood extractions and his first treatments with anabolic agents. In March, Tugboat would begin his growth hormone and insulin treatments, and the results were immediately apparent. He began to stand out with a remarkable second place in the Tour of the Basque Country, which he lost by only 12 seconds, in a time trial against a local and doped with the preparation of Dr. Losa, Iban Mayo. A great result that showed that he was also good in the mountains. But this performance would be surpassed only 2 weeks later in the Liege-Bastogne-Liege. 6 days earlier, Hamilton had put 2 bags of fresh blood in his veins, because La Doyenne was marked on his calendar. Lance Armstrong was racing that day, and he had to prove to the world that he was the only one who could beat him on the road. Tugboat immediately showed his level by leading the group on the toughest climbs in the middle of the race, such as on La Roudette, but Armstrong was not far behind. In fact, it was the Ferrari client himself who attacked beforehand, along with other top doped riders, such as Spain's Samuel Sanchez and Italy's Michele Bartoli. And they escaped, but they did not find the ideal understanding, and with a few kilometres to go in San Nicolas, the bunch caught up with them. It was there where Tugboat made his magic move. In the rain, he jumped out of the peloton, while excellent doped riders like the friend of the women in the street, Michael Bogart, or the Basque hippie Perroflauta Iban Mayo tried to chase him in vain. Although they performed much better when the rain fell on their red eyes, Hamilton was untreatable and showed how the fresh blood in his veins made him a superhero. He won his first monument, and in no more and no less than the one that Lance Armstrong had been chasing his whole life. And he also became the first American to achieve this triumph, which, by the way, is still in his palmares, despite the fact that it has been proven that he won it completely doped to the gills. His streak continued with an excellent win in the Tour of Romandy just a few days later, winning in a commanding manner in the last stage of the first part of his season. Thereafter, he decided to follow the advice of his director Rees, and just like the bald Danish rider did in the weeks leading up to the Tour de France, Hamilton began doping like a mule in May with anabolics and EPO before disappearing completely at the Dauphiné Libéré, where he even abandoned before the Grand Boucle. This was because Tugboat was in a period of blood extractions, the same blood that he would put back into his vein in the first days of the Tour de France, as well as, of course, in the rest days. And the truth is that he could not have started better in the short prologue in Paris, beaten by Bradley McGee, as our dog friend finished in 6th position ahead of Lance Armstrong, Joseba Balocchi, and fellow doctors like Santiago Botero and Buffalo Gutierrez. But unfortunately for him, the next day, in the first road stage, the unexpected happened. Again, he fell in the sprint, and again he broke his collarbone, but this time in a much more violent manner than in the previous year's Giro d'Italia. Tyler himself assured the cameras that he would have to retire, but the magic of Bjarne Riis made everything possible, and the next day, with a very bulky bandage, and before the surprised eyes of all, Tugboat appeared on the starting line. Suddenly, the reeking Hamilton was the new American hero. Maybe not as flashy as the guy who survived cancer to win the Tour, but his story had a touch of epicness and mysticism that Hollywood screenwriters love so much. So he decided to go ahead and hang on for the first week, despite the intense pain, presumably alleviated by ingesting blood in the best possible state within his veins. The first test of fire was a stage of almost 220 kilometres, in which he climbed no more and no less than the Galibier on its hardest side, and with a finish on the Alpe d'Huez. While Iban Mayo showed that the chemistry of the Euskaltel team was at stratospheric levels that season, a tenacious Hamilton reached the finish line in a surprising manner, with his fellow doctors Paco Mancebo, Barillo, and with Lance Armstrong himself at the finish line, beating even a Jan Ullrich who had radioactive legs in that edition of the Tour. The story also began to work well on a publicity level. Tugboat could not make hard attacks because of his injury, but he could hold on, which, together with his gestures of pain, made him a hero for all those haters of this channel that would not take into account his dirty tricks and his past. He was simply already an idol, because he was doing his job with the aim of getting much more fame and money. But this story would have an epic ending that would be remembered for decades as being one of the great raids of the Tour de France. Just the day after the penultimate bag of blood was injected into Tugboat's veins, Hamilton, who was 7th overall, 9 minutes behind Lance Armstrong, decided to attack. It was on the last mountain day of that tour, with tough passes like the Soudet and the La Roue, but leaving a long way to go to the finish line in the coastal town of Bayonne. With 140 kilometres to go on the Soudet, Hamilton decided to attack alone. In a strange and peculiar way, feeling like Trevor Phillips in the lost caravans of Grand Theft Auto 5, he started pedalling harder and harder, as his renewed blood pumped his tanned legs. The distance increased so much that he managed to take 4 minutes off the peloton, which, until well into the day, didn't even know how to organise itself to chase that blindfolded and totally doped man. It was an absurd fight, one man against an entire peloton, for over 70 kilometres of terrain with no mountainous difficulties. It seemed that Lance Armstrong wanted it that way, and he decided to hand over that stage to his former friend, as if he wanted the cameras to focus on another protagonist, so he could concentrate on his fight against Jan Ullrich in the final time trial. Hamilton raised his arms and was flattered by all his rivals, who understood his feat and also the manner in which he had conquered it, in the same way in which he had won Liege, with an absolutely despicable mix of Riis and Armstrong doping. Not content with that, he was only 9 seconds away from winning the final time trial, the one in which Ullrich ceded the throne to Armstrong, and in which a doped David Miller, who would win months later, full of EPO, the World Time Trial, beat him by that slim margin, despite the cold, the rain and the almost 50 kilometres around Nantes. The final result was a 4th place overall, 6 minutes behind Lance. He didn't manage to beat him, but if he hadn't broken his collarbone, he would have been on the podium. It was his second to last race with the CSC team, just before he left for Phonak, where he almost lost his life in his attempt to win the Tour de France. But that, dear Tugboat friends, is another story. We'll see you in the next one.